Commissioner Myers.
Myers, aye.
Commissioner O'Hara. Here. Commissioner Hanslick.
Hanslick here.
Commissioner Ashcraft.
Here.
Commissioner Allenbrand.
Allenbrand, aye.
And Chairman Eilert.
Here. All are present, so we'll turn the meeting over to County Manager Penny Postoke Ferguson.
Chairman and Commissioners, good afternoon. So we are here today to present the 2023 proposed budget. So with me today, I have Scott Neufeld, our Bureau Chief and Budget Director, and Robin Symes, Deputy Budget Director, budget staff, County Manager's Office, and others represented as well. So this is an unusual budget. And during interesting times, we've been fighting the pandemic for 2 years. So we've got kind of a lot of things to update you on as we transition out of that. We feel like this budget is fiscally responsible and allows us to provide the quality services that our community expects and deserves. And so the agenda for today, we'll dive in a little bit more about the pressures that the current economy landscape brings us, especially property tax pressures and workforce pressures. And we've talked to you at length about both of those. Our lens for decisions are the board priorities and the community survey priorities. We'll go into the numbers a bit with the budget summary and multi-year financial projections, and you'll see that I think that going through those numbers, it demonstrates that we have a strong financial plan to take us into the future. We'll highlight requests for additional resources, and over the coming weeks, we'll dive into a little bit more detail by departments. Then we'll talk about performance measures, capital improvement program, and we'll summarize going back to the strategic priorities and the progress that this budget and leading up to this budget we were able to achieve, and then conclude with the schedule. So as I said, as we come out of the pandemic phase, our economy is looking very favorable to our revenue, but with that favorability comes certain pressures. And so we want to talk about the top two pressures that I mentioned, and that's the property tax pressures and the workforce demands. So as I said, there's some optimism and it's somewhat cautious, but the place where it looks very favorable for our revenue, as you all know, is our housing market boom. We've talked about valuation. Bo made his report, and I know you've heard many things from your constituents. The sales and use tax growth is very favorable. This time last year, it was more of a something we couldn't call a trend yet. It was so favorable, and we didn't have answers yet. So now we've been able to see the trend and count on that level of and increasing level sales and use tax growth to factor into our revenue. Interest on investments are looking favorable as we look into the future. So those things are all very much a positive on the revenue side. We need to also be a little bit cautious, and that's why we have our reserves and our 5-year forecast, so that we can be able to adapt if there's inflation pressures. We know there's construction inflation, for example, interest rates, what they continue to do and how that impacts our costs. War on Ukraine and other things that may impact the future. So we have a strong financial plan. We've been able to show that we can adapt quickly to short-term demands or more longer-term recession type of demands. So this has been a period of property valuation increase that is a little unusual. So with that, we have to react in not a typical way for a budget recommendation. So with that, we are including a 1 mil levy reduction for 2023 that includes county taxing district at 0.82 mil reduction, library taxing district 0.1 mil reduction, parks and recreation taxing district 0.08 mil reduction. This would make the 5th mill levy reduction in 6 years. And so the feedback that you all gave me at the budget retreat is showing up here. I listened to you. I showed you a scenario of a half a mil rollback. The message I got is if we can, and we can do it responsibly, push that much more, and include parks and library. So this is the result of what our staff team has been able to achieve, along with other things that I'll highlight in the coming pages. So addressing workforce market pressures. You may recall the committee of the whole that we had a couple of months ago that Maury and HR led on highlighting the details of where we are. You know that the pressures are across the country, across all sectors, but we did highlight a bit more, how does that impact Johnson County workforce? And we're not immune. The low unemployment rates impacting us, the great resignation that includes how employees are evaluating how they want to work after coming out of COVID. And then, you know, some are retiring early, and then the pipeline of employees coming in is a lower number. So all those pressures have made employees across all sectors really look at increased pay, increased benefits, what are newer benefits, for example, remote work or flexible schedules, and overall a new sense of purpose and meaningful interactions. So how did we address that in this budget? Our compensation strategy is outlined on the slide. And first I want to start by saying we can't wait. Based on the market pressures, we can't wait till 2023, which this budget focuses on. So that's why we have in 2022 a planned compression pool of 2%. So what this budget assumes is that we're able to implement that in 22 to really look at our salary structure and look at specifically Johnson County, where are the priorities of employees as they relate to others within our organization and years of experience, et cetera. We know there's areas that we need to address, and that study is underway. So this budget does include the assumption that we're able to implement that and then that carrying forward. It includes a merit pool of 3% and a market pool of 2% in 2023, and then also a 1% increase from 3 to 4% in the supplemental retirement match. So the last point where it says maintain flexibility in order to stay competitive, we think this will go a long ways in making us competitive, but the market keeps changing. We need to keep looking at it. This may be a multi-year approach, but this is a good first step that we feel is a responsible way to address and really meet our needs for our employees in such a way that we can provide public service, good public service. So next, board priorities and community survey. As I stated, those are two lenses that we made decisions throughout this budget process. So as a reminder, the board priorities, you know this, focuses on capital projects, vulnerable populations, transit, and innovative initiatives. The community priorities, as you may recall from our presentation from ETC, public safety is noted, 94% reported feeling safe in the county, and so we want to maintain those high satisfaction rates, and you'll see that show up in the budget presentation. The most important services for the county to provide includes EMS, public health, election office, Johnson County Parks and Recreation District. This is according to the community survey. And then most critical roles for the government, health and human services, public safety, law enforcement, and maintaining quality leadership. Highest priority services, as a reminder, if you factor in satisfaction and in where to invest, then those three priorities look slightly different, and that's aging and human services, mental health, and public health. And later in the presentation, we'll highlight the details of where the progress in those priorities show up in the budget and otherwise. So as I get ready to turn it over to more detail in the numbers to the budget office, I first want to just summarize again. This is a very balanced, responsible budget that addresses property tax pressures, the workforce pressures, maintains our current service levels with a few enhancements, and then looking at the additional requests for resources, really being able to focus on the highest priorities and get a few of those included, and we'll highlight those in a few minutes. And then also a prudent use of reserves, really looking at the 5-year forecast and this positions us well into the future. So with that, I'll turn over to Robin Symes to start the numbers on the budget summary.
And actually, Scott's going to
Oh,
start.
sorry, Scott.
That's okay.
I had a feeling you were going to do that. Robin could do it, so it would be fine. The budget principles are what we've long had in place, and you guys probably have them memorized. But I think it's good to at least put them out here for the public to see. It's the basis for our decisions. They're very important. We don't take them for granted, but they've been long held. So we fund ongoing operating expenditures with ongoing revenue. That's a real key that the rating agencies look at. It's also really a predicator of having a healthy budget and really being balanced. Maintaining the sufficient general fund reserve is incredibly important for the AAA, or triple AAA bond rating. And also, if we have any kind of unknown or unusual circumstances happen, as we are all aware, at the start of the pandemic, when the economy was shut down, we weren't sure what we were facing, and we went into contingency mode. But I remember there were members of the board that thought even at the highest level of budget reductions, it wouldn't be enough. And luckily, things kind of stabilized, and the year didn't turn out too badly. But those things have happened from time to time over the years, and the reserves are certainly important to have when those things happen, because at the end of the day, we really want to be able to maintain services and provision to the public, and that's really why that's so important. And lastly, try to be prudent with our financial management, our projections, so that we don't have shortfalls, not to be overly ambitious or positive, so that we know we can stay within budget. In terms of the summary, the budget summary, the total budget is $1.64 billion, and that's $1.15 billion in expenditures and $488 million in reserves. We budget the reserves, we include them in the budget because it provides more flexibility. Those reserve amounts, however, cannot be spent unless the board authorizes them. And you see from time to time where we have a use of reserves on a budget, on an agenda item, and that's because staff can't spend those dollars without your approval. We're looking at 24.568 mils, which is a 1 mil reduction. We had a lot of conversation, and I sent out an email earlier this year that pointed back to the last time the mill levy was at that level. It is the lowest in a number of years. It's comprised of 17.744 for the county taxing district. Of note, that's where it was before the mill levy was raised in 2016. So we've erased that increase, if you will. The library's at 3.808. And the Park and Rec District is at 3.016. And I would note that the Library District doesn't include Olathe, so they actually get very similar amounts of ad valorem because the Park District is countywide. There's 4,173 FTEs, and that's 37 more than last year. And if you noted in the budget message, there was quite a bit of out of the budget process activity this year. We had some reductions in the rec fund due to fluctuations, and then a number of FTEs added primarily in mental health and then a few other places. And we've bring those to you when they happen, but there was quite a bit of activity outside.
Scott, if you're going to speak to this later, that's fine. I'll be quiet. But the 1.15 in expenditures, that is the entire organization, including outside funds that come into us. What is the level of property tax revenue we anticipate, the total?
The Ed Eilert slide is coming up, sir.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure that we can break out those expenditures. Okay, thank you.
I do have one quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so with all of the debt coming on from wastewater, is this going to impact our bond rating?
No, we talk extensively with not just our financial advisor, Baker Tilly, but also with the rating agencies when we do reviews. And usually we talk to all three rating agencies at least once a year when we issue debt and go through that. And Baker Tilly, it takes lead on analyzing those things, but we're in good shape, both with the wastewater rate model and our total debt capacity. And I think Robin did you have some debt? Okay. You were looking like you did, so sorry. So yeah, we do pay attention to that, but we're in good shape. Okay. Typically, it's noted in the rating agency reports that we have very manageable debt levels.
Okay, and then I just want to note that our expenditures in 2022 is $1 billion, 300, 3,000?
1,300,000,000.
What, 300,000, anyway. And then this year, it was forecasted to go down to 969 million. So now we're going to go up to 1.153. And I just want it noted that this is above the forecasted budget for 2026. And last year, we forecast that our expenditures would be at 1.144 billion. So we are exceeding what the forecast was for 2026 and 2023. So I just want to note that.
Right, and it's frequently various significant one-time expenditures that cause those variations. Typically, your trend line on your personnel cost is pretty steady. It's a combination of increase in salary and benefit cost and modest increases in the number of FTEs. And then there is some, inflation that does show up.
Yeah.
That,
The other
is-
thing-
we do reforecast every year, and the outlook does change from year to year.
The other thing that I would add is from 22 to 23, originally, we did not have the 60 million for the second half of the ARPA funding. And now in our projections, we have that. So that's the $60 million is that grant revenue. So it's not that we've increased county supported expenditures or ad valorem. That's just the additional grant revenue coming on. Another example would be probably the mental health, public health, all of those grant revenues that we've received recently. Those were not in those original projections last year because we didn't have that at the time. And so all of those fluctuations do happen, especially with grant fee and other debt revenue.
And it does seem like we've had more outside the budget process activity of that sort in the past year. It seems like it's really been on the uptick. Obviously, with the pandemic, that influenced a lot of what went on, but also in the last year or so, it seems like there's a lot more money coming from Topeka, mid-year, et cetera, whether it's mental health, JCDS. So that has really caused a lot of fluctuations.
I think it's worth noting that, when you do a 4 or 5 year projection, that's an estimate based upon the information you have right now. So it's not unusual for those numbers to change as you focus in on next year.
And one other question that I will have is on our employees, the employees that we have 100,000 and above, are they leaving at the same rate as our employees that are in the lower salary range?
I think it's mostly across the board, but I'll look to Maury as the interim HR director to see if he's got more information to offer.
No, I don't. We can look at that.
Can
but
you look
I
at
know.
that? I'm just curious about that. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, moving on, I'm gonna have to put my glasses on for this one. This is the county expenditure budget, and as usual, the chairman was one step ahead of me. So this is really looking at the budget in a couple of ways. And so what we have is the expenditure budget and the reserves are walked down. We talked about that a minute ago where we had $1.64 billion total budget, but $1.15 billion in expenditures. And so that's the expenditures across all funds. We do have some double entry, and that's really where expenses show up as a transfer once, and then when it actually gets expended and cash out the door a second time. So that brings the number down to 1.076 billion. And then when you get into the county taxing district expenditure budget, and we've got the detail on the next slide, that's $485 million, and that's what the chairman was alluding to a minute ago. And so on the next slide, we have that step down. And so again, we've already taken the reserves out. We're just talking about expenditures right now, and that's the $1.153 billion. And when you take wastewater out for next year, that's $265 million. And as we know, wastewater is fee supported, and so that's a separate taxing district. Quite frankly, we can't move money back and forth between there, and it's completely fee supported. The next couple pieces are our governing bodies that are also separate taxing district. We have library, and they have a general and a special use fund, that's $48 million. And that, again, they have their own separate levy, it shows up separately, and we do separate decision sets there. And then with Park and Rec, they have $54 million in their government funds and $30 million in the enterprise fund, which that's the fee-supported fund that really is activity-based, whether it's the after-school care or sports leagues, things of that nature, wide variety. The next piece is grant-funded expenditures, which is $138 million. Outside funds with dedicated revenue source is $43 million. An example of that would be the airport, district court trustee, there's a few like that. We have also fee-supported expenditures within the general fund, and that's things like contractor licensing. And then I talked about the double entry accounting and the cost allocation. Those are the ones that are not true expenditures out the door, and that gets you to the 484. The thing about the 484 is that's where your 17 mills is. It's where your motor vehicle tax, your sales and use tax is, and really it's the bulk of your local tax-supported activities. So that is what we talked about a minute ago, and that's where the bulk of the decisions are made by the board, because so many of these other ones are set, whether it's by fees or grants from the state, et cetera, or the feds. And so that's really the heart and soul of much of our consideration as we go through the budget process. We review the other funds, but that's what the focus is on. And it is, really less than a third of the total budget.
I'd clarify, you said this is where the 17 mil and not the 24 mil is?
Yeah, the mills for the park and the library, which you guys do decide, are in the library general and special use fund and the park and recreation government funds. They were kind of was that the third and fourth line there? So
Okay, so the 17 mil
is within the 484.
44, the other two funds are the, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. And those are separate taxing districts and statutorily very separate. So we really, again, it's not that you guys don't make the decisions on that, but we put quite a bit of focus on the county tax-supported kind of part of the fund.
Well, again, I would emphasize that when you look at the total expenditures of $1.15 billion, if you put our general fund expenditures along with parks and libraries, $484 million plus another 500 or 100 million from the other two, you're talking about a third of that 1.15 billion. So it's and those other funds come from other sources, not property tax.
Could you just explain this wastewater operations, maintenance, and sewer repair construction finance plan of 265.2? And so those are paid by fees, but yet it's in the total for the tax-supported expenditures.
No, it's not. And this is a step-down chart. And so we're starting with the total budget up at the top.
Oh, I see what it's doing.
And then
Okay,
pulling things
okay.
out to get to the
These are-
tax-supported budget.
okay,
So,
got it.
Yeah, and
Subtractions.
it's kind of backwards from how we typically show things. And I should have
Right.
said step down at the beginning.
Got it.
I
Thank you.
apologize.
Scott, I've always enjoyed your pie charts for various reasons, but it's very clear where you have all these breakdowns identified and the amounts associated therewith.
This is really confusing.
It's very easy to look at and explain.
And we typically have that in the public hearing presentation, and I would be remiss if I took credit for that pie chart. It's quite possible that one of the people to my left did that pie chart. But we can certainly put that together and bring it to the next
Together
one.
Sooner,
Yeah.
Sure.
sooner the
This
better.
is really confusing.
Yeah. Thank you.
So the next slide has reserves, and again, this one is a step down with the grand total at the top, and it's really pulling out the various funds. And so wastewater has 200 million. That's higher than it normally is. Part of that is prescribed by formula in the O&M, the Operations and Maintenance Fund. And what we'll see is as we go through the Nelson project, I think the plan will be to spend some of those down. And so those should be going down in the coming years. Again, Nelson's is actually larger than Tomahawk, significantly larger, and that will be the plan there. You can see that the library has about 15 million. Park and Rec government is 15, enterprise is 14, public health at 9.9, developmental supports is at 7, 911 is 4.2, and that's that's a very specific fund, only certain things. Airports at 4.7, mental health at 5.1, and so on to get down to 197 million in the general fund. We've got more detail on the general fund, but as you know, with public health, developmental supports, and mental health especially, they are in much, much better shape than they were before. We had Chad's plan to address his, and what we'll see over time is looking at some of those other funds and what's an appropriate way to get those back to their targets. Although I'm really enjoying mental health being above its target after all those years where it was low. So that one we're feeling pretty good about. But we do have significant reserves, and a lot of that is, quite frankly, is how we got through the pandemic. I mentioned the expenditure reductions we did when the economy was shut down. Well, we ended up cutting expenditures that we didn't need to because we were being prudent and cautious, and the economy did really well in the second half of the year, so we bumped up, and then the federal funds have helped out. But again, Robin's going to go through some of that detail in a minute.
Scott,
And,
could you remind us what SRCFP stands for?
Yeah, it's the Sewer Repair and Construction Finance Plan. And so if you look on slide 16, Robin actually put it out there, so that way I didn't have to look it up because I have a hard time remembering that. But it's basically their capital and their debt service for their capital.
Thank you.
And like you, Commissioner Ashcraft, I can never remember it, so Susan can, I'm sure. So we're going to get into a little more detail, so I'm going to turn it over to Robin on the next slides.
All right. When we pull together our financial five-year forecast, we look at our revenue and expenditure assumptions for the 5 years. And so I'm just going to go through the revenue assumptions first, and then I'll cover the expenditures. So this chart has some of our major revenues and then other sources as well. So we have our sales tax. That is projected to be 2% in the out years, and that we're returning to normal growth levels. As Scott mentioned, sales tax has been relatively high, and so we have adjusted that. We've had a paradigm shift, and we've increased that and kept the 22 increase of 2% over our 21 actuals. For use tax, we're also back to normal growth level at 4%. However, we know that this year, at the beginning of the year, we've still seen high growth. Ted in our office, he contacted the state. The April sales and use was actually down just a little bit. And so that is why we're being cautious. At this time, we'll continue to monitor it. But again, with the economy the way it's going, we feel like we need to hold here and continue to monitor. And if we need to increase that, we can as well in the future. Then going on to motor vehicle tax, that's been a steady revenue source for us, and 3% is the normal growth on that. Recording fees, we have that about $6 million. That's pretty much our standard recording fees in a normal year. I know in the past couple of years with the low interest rates and the housing boom, that's been relatively high. We have seen that drop off all of a sudden at the beginning of this year. Obviously, with the interest rates going up, we're not seeing the refinancing that we have in the past. And so, again, continue to monitor that and make changes as we need to. Special Highway Fund, that's pretty level. We look for the state to give us those estimates, and we keep that constant. It's directly connected with the CARS funding, and so as that fluctuates up, then the CARS funding also increases.
Is that basically the gas tax?
Yes.
So you're projecting that to be stable over the next 5 years?
Yeah, the state doesn't give us a whole lot of range, so we keep that. As it fluctuates up, we obviously increase those expenditures. It's really an in and an out for that program. So whatever that revenue comes in, then that's what we spend for it. There is an additional mill levy piece to that, but that's not included in this that the county provides. For assessed valuation growth, you can see obviously in 2023 we have the 9.7%. In our out years, that does drop off to 4.5 and then down to 4. Now, I know it looks a little steep decline compared to what we've been seeing. Obviously, with interest rates going up, we'll probably see a decline in housing in house sales. However, I just want to remind you, just like what happened this year, we started out with 11%, and then with appeals and other IRBs and other changes to that valuation, it does drop. So we did drop to 9.7. And so even within this 4.5% and 4% in the out years, our real property is starting at 6%. So and that's even high compared to previous years. And so it's not like we've dropped it significantly. It's just that starting point does go down due to appeals.
What's the residential percentage?
Of the total?
Yeah, you got assessed valuation change, and you got 9.7%. So what, on the residential, what is it?
On the real property, I've got that here. Hold on one
Well,
sec.
real includes commercials.
Right, are you talking about just the
Residential.
We can grab that for you.
Okay.
The part that's tricky is I believe about 60-some percent is residential versus commercial, but the assessments rate is higher than that. I can't do that in my head, but we can crunch those numbers.
Yeah, I
because
know I have
we
it,
do get the amounts from Bo, but those are all appraised amounts, not assessed amounts. So we can crosswalk that, but we'll have to do a little spreadsheet.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But we'd be happy to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I think I have it, I just have to
See,
find
On the
it.
assessed valuation, commercial is at 25%, and residential is 11.5%.
Correct, the assessment, yeah.
Right, so I guess, I see. All right, yes, I would like those numbers.
Okay. And so then moving down to the last line, our ad valorem tax revenue, our 5-year forecast, as Penny stated, does include the 1 mil rollback in 2023, and then we do assume a constant mill levy in 2024 to 2027.
The recording fees, does that include what used to be called the mortgage registration fee process?
Those, we used to talk about those together when we had them, and that was the deal where across, I want to say about 5 years, 4 or 5 years, the document fees went up and the mortgage registration fee was phased out. So I believe that's been zero for probably 3 years, maybe 4. And so what has remained is the document fees, although they are quite a bit larger. The net of that really depends on volume, but that was a pretty significant reduction. But it depends on how busy of a year it is, how much it is.
Well, as I recall, those fees were running 15 to 20 million a year,
Yes.
just from the mortgage registration fee, and now we're looking at 6 million. So that shows the impact of when the legislature reduced or eliminated the mortgage registration.
Right, and that hit at a time where we had significantly reduced our expenditures and our FTEs for a number of years to get through the recession with a constant mill levy, despite drops in valuation, I'd say in 3 or 4 out of 5 years. And so we had really cut and cut and cut, and then we lost that revenue source. As the chairman said, we had a couple years over 20 million on mortgage registration, but an average year was probably 16 million. A good year was closer to 20. And so they did increase the document fees, but not nearly by what we lost. So that was tough.
So Chairman, so that's where the mortgage registration fees was under recording fee because,
No.
oh, that was a whole different
No,
line
we would
item?
talk about them together because they were tied to the same process, and frequently the volume would go to, well, it's together frequently because the mortgage registrations drive a lot of the document fees, not all of them, but a lot of them, and so they would both go up, and so we would talk about them together. But they've always been 2 separate sources that are just from that same process in TTV.
Because that was a huge loss to all our historical groups, that they relied on that funding for, our organizations in the county who doing historical.
Yeah, we gave out grants. I think it was probably $600,000 or $700,000 a year through the Heritage Trust group. And I think somebody on the dais knows all about that.
Yes, I do.
Commissioner O'Hara was on.
I was a member of that board for several years and actually chaired it for a couple of years. But I'm back to the ad valorem. So we are increasing property taxes by 16.2 million. Is that correct?
I can get it, but I don't have it.
You're just subtracting them. Yes, in the current estimate, correct.
Okay.
And that's just with the valuation growth
Okay,
and a
thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so moving on to the expenditure assumptions. Looking at the merit pool for 2023, as stated, we have the 3%, and then in out years, a range of 3 to 4. The market adjustment is 2%, with out years range of 1 to 2. Again, as Penny talked about, flexibility and watching the market to see what happens. Personal services slippage, this is a little confusing. We call it the vacancy factor. And so on all positions, not 24/7 positions and also not on departments of 10 or less, we apply a vacancy factor, assuming that we are going to have vacancies, so we should not be budgeting at full employment. And so that's where we budget all of those positions at 97%. Again, to help out with funding, knowing that we shouldn't be budgeting that full amount, knowing that we're going to have vacancies. So we do budget less than what that full position is actually being paid. Health insurance increase currently for 2023, we have a 0%. Scott will talk about the healthcare fund here soon. It's obviously in good shape. The wellness program has definitely helped that out, and the employees have done a great job in helping keep those costs down.
And what's our reserves in that?
We'll have the slide here in a couple. And so in the out years, though we are looking at obviously higher health insurance increases with the market, and so conservatively, we're looking at 5 to 6%. And then ongoing tax-supported expenditures, our requests for additional resources, we have about 2 to 3 in the next couple of years, and then possibly 5 to 7 in the out years. And then one-time expenditure requests in our 5-year forecast, we have $9 million, assuming that we're obviously going to need to use reserves for those one-time CIP and requests for additional resources. So how that relates then to the 5-year forecast. A couple of things I wanted to point out here. Obviously, we show a balanced 5-year forecast. You can see the total proposed budget line is that top line across all of the bar charts there, or bar graphs. In 2024, we talked about the ARPA funding, the $60 million that we added to 2023. Well, in 2024, that does go away, and that's primarily the drop that you see from 2023 to 2024 is due to that funding. Our 2025 through 27 increases are 0.8%, 2.8% in 2026, and 2.1% in 2027 for a total budget increase. From 2024 to 2026, for the use of reserves, that's that red line, you can see that it goes from 16 million to 13. 9 million of that is what I just talked about for the one-time CIP and RERs that we anticipate funding. And then the difference there is wastewater, and that they would have additional uses of reserves for their projects. And then in 2027, I wanted to point out, it seems like a higher number there. So that's the final year of the Public Safety Sales Tax 3 that will be coming in. It ends March 2027. And so that's where we'll be using those reserves that we've built up to make that last debt payment. And so the last piece that we'll be using is about 17.6 million of that. So that's why that's high there. You have about 17.5 million for Public Safety 3, 9 million for the county general fund, and then the remainder would be wastewater. So I just wanted to point out that spike there in the last year. All right, so now when we look at this compared to our reserves, excuse me, it's a lot of numbers, so I wanted to walk through them with you. The top blue lines are our beginning fund balance for each year. And then we talked about the use of one-time expenditures for RERs and CIPs. And so that's the 20.9 million, the 9 million across, and then the 26.6. Because again, this is the general fund, not wastewater. Estimated ending fund balance is the 197, and it goes down to 143 or 33% in year 2027. So those are the two that relate. I wanted to point out. The 197 in 2023 relates to the beginning balance in 2024 of 197. So there you can see where those two tie out all the way across, because that is our true general fund balance. However, there are different pieces to that that are either restricted or designated. So then what we usually do is we pull out the auxiliary fund, which is designated for healthcare, and also anything that the board deems, the board has to approve the use of those reserves. So that's about 61 million right now. And then we get a revised estimated ending fund balance of 29% for 2023. Then we have the estimated 2023 ARPA funding, and that's actually the revenue loss that is estimated for, that we'll be receiving that ARPA funding for. So once we add that back in, then we go back to the 33%. However, I will note that I know Maury has a plan. They're working on the uses for that will be coming back to the board and one-time needs of that. And so to me, the line to focus on would probably be that middle blue line, the revised estimated ending fund balance, where it starts at 29% in 2023, and then we end at 22% in 2027. So I know that's confusing.
So is the plan, looks like that the plan is to spend the ARPA funds over a 5-year period?
No, all that is saying is if we don't spend it, that money's there each year. So that's where you'd look at it beforehand, and if we didn't spend it, we would have 22 million. And that just stays constant.
I thought that we had 117 million in ARPA funds.
Correct, but that is not all that the county was, I believe a lot of those will be going out to other organizations and other federal funding, and Maury can help out with that.
And there's no simple way to reflect those, to be honest with you. And so the 22 represents the revenue loss formula, and so that was not tied to expenditures, so we showed that in here. At this point, we have that money. The board hasn't made any, staff hasn't made any recommendations towards that money. There's other money that we're going to have later in the year, and as we go through that process, I think Maury's bringing that in a couple weeks, a framework. We will be able to figure out how much of it we should show here versus not, based on how we dispense with those funds.
Okay,
So
so
those
right now-
decisions will be coming before you soon, and some of that may fold into these numbers later, but that's what's in there now.
Okay, but right now we have 117 million.
We have promised 117. We got half of it last year, and we're getting half later
Okay.
this year. I don't think we haven't received it yet, have we? We got 58.5 or whatever.
Shortly.
Yeah. I want to go back to the sales tax for the courthouse. Does it look like that the fund balance or the rate of sales tax will allow us to accomplish within 10 years what we stated, or sooner than that?
Well, currently, in Public Safety Sales Tax 3, there's a reserve of 31 million. So, but that includes that last use of 17.6 million.
So we're about 14 million ahead.
Exactly, so we're 14 million ahead. However, I just want to caution that that's in 2027, which is still 4 years out. If there's any kind of recession or downturn and sales and use tax does decrease, then that's where that cushion is going to help us in the future so that we can make that payment.
Now, we'll have 3 new judges, I assume. Will we be able to build out some of the unfinished areas?
It's really, and I don't know the numbers on each courtroom build out, but I think that we could, we would just have less buffer. And, we know that it's likely that we'll have a recession between now and then, but you never know how long and how deep. So we are substantially ahead right now, which is great. And, the project's complete, so there's no more expenditures on the original project. So theoretically, we would be able to look at some of those where we're ahead by the 14 million when we finish out I think that would make sense. That's a primary reason for that sales tax, was those 2 buildings.
Right.
The language is broader than that, but that's what we told the voters we would spend it on. So that does make sense to me. We haven't really talked to facilities about those numbers yet. On those, but I know there's extra capacity there, so.
Well, it would seem to me that, furnishing out, I'll say 3 courtrooms would be a legitimate expenditure of the courthouse funds, but anyway.
Yeah,
Just my opinion.
I think that, Don always made the language broad enough that we wouldn't get into a corner, but I think that's pretty consistent with what we told the public.
Yeah.
This is actually good news, and since we are ahead, that's not terribly problematic. I wouldn't want to spend the whole 14 and have no margin for error.
Yes.
The AAA bonding, AAA bonding is based off of the revised estimated ending fund balance, or?
We usually talk through that with them, and so they will be looking at the 42%, us going down to the 33. However, they do know that some of those are designated uses of reserves. We do talk to them, obviously, we're conservative in some of that, so that they know that usually on most years that we start out, or we show our fifth year going down, however, we usually improve each year, just due to, financial management, watching the reserves and expenditures. And so we have a good relationship with them, and so we're able to talk through that forecast. So we feel comfortable right now where we're at.
They look for several things, and they look for us to be conservative, and for most years to turn out better than projected, and we do that. They look for a board that is willing at times to raise the mill levy if it's called for, and they also look for an organization that can cut expenditures when it's needed to be done. And we have done both those things. So we typically have been very consistent with their expectations. One of the things we always tell them is that if we get up into the upper 30s or into the 40% range on general fund, that is not going to last. We will spend that money down in a measured approach over time, not with a structural deficit, but on one time, in that we're probably going to be shooting for somewhere between 25 and 35%. They would like us to stay over 30. With the strength of our economy, the diversity of our economy, and our track record, I think we could go below 30 and still be AAA. But my comfort zone is between 30 and 35, to be honest with you.
Okay. All right.
And that comes from Robin and I and Leslie have talked to the rating agencies a number of times over the last 15 years. And so we understand kind of what their expectations are, the kind of questions they ask. And so that's kind of our gut feel.
Okay.
Well, we had aggressive conversations during the recession when they were reducing bond ratings for other entities and requiring significantly larger reserves. And so we went through that process with our AAA rating still in effect and a lower reserve ability. So
What's the balance on our courthouse bonds?
We can look
We
that
can
up.
get that. I don't have that off the top of my head. We can get that for you.
Okay. And just hypothetically, would using the ARPA funds to pay down that debt so that our the people in Johnson County could have a reduction in the sales tax of 0.25% earlier, is that even allowable? Because that's infrastructure, but I know it's debt. So is that allowable use of that money?
Well, two responses here. I'll start with the ability to do that. My understanding is you need to go back and look at the ability even to end that sales tax earlier. That's one issue. Secondly, as to the use of the funds, I doubt it, but it's something that we could look at.
Okay, it's just a hypothetical question.
The thing I would remind the board is this is a sales tax that's shared with the cities, and I would be very surprised if they didn't have that built into their CIP, probably for things like roads, because that's easier to scale back on. But I know that when Robin and I went to Overland Park for public safety sales tax number 2, that had been an economic development sales tax where our portion went to the school districts under economic development grants, and the cities received their portion. And I still to this day remember being it was the Finance and Administration Committee. It wasn't the full council with Robin, and they were grilling us about this sales tax, and they asked Christy Stallings, because she was the finance person back then. They said, do we have it programmed into our CIP? And she said yes. And they knew that if the public safety sales tax 2, that would continue that funding source for them. And since this was a 10-year tax and there was never any discussion about ending it early. My guess is the cities are expecting that. So if we were to end it early and we could legally, we would want to.
It'd be huge.
but
The
the
northeast
city-
cities
but-
all have it.
But the cities would be able to initiate their own sales tax?
I think
No.
that's case by case on
necessarily.
what the authority is, so I
No,
think.
that's up to the state legislature. You know, I would simply say this, I understand where the cities are at, but we need to look solely at our responsibility. And if we can end that sales tax earlier, then we should.
Well, it would end it for everybody, is my point. That's just.
Right.
That's.
Right.
Yes, I mean, that would be a 0.25% reduction in our sales tax, and that's been a lot of discussion. And I think that our balance on that is 134 million, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, we'll look. And
Okay.
that decision would probably best be made in like 2026, just because, again, you don't want to end something, especially if the sales tax. We would want to wait over the next few years just to make sure that there isn't a recession to where we would need that additional funding
Well,
to
yeah.
be able to pay those bonds.
Correct, but I'm talking about if it's possible to use the ARPA money to pay it off.
Yeah, I know. Okay, thank you. Yes.
All right. Continue, please.
Okay. Just ending here on some of the financial information, multi-fund use of reserves. These are some of our main funds. You can see we have the targets listed there, and then the ending fund balance. Happy to report that all funds are within the targeted range for all of those at the end of the 2027 year. All use of funds here are for one-time capital needs. The one thing that I would note, I know developmental supports will be coming back to the board for a plan for the use of their reserves, and I think public health has already started conversations on looking at a plan for that as well. And obviously, library operating, part of those reserves are for their master or their capital plan. And so while they seem high, I know that there are plans for the use of that. At this point, I'm going to turn over to Scott to talk about the healthcare fund.
Thank you, Robin. The healthcare fund is a significant expenditure for us, and it's highly volatile. And a few years ago, we were doing fine. The first half of the year, we finished up the budget process for the following year, and then expenditures went up, I believe, about 20% in half a year. And what this did was it left us with a shortage that year, but also starting with our hands tied behind our back for the next year. Fortunately, that trend stabilized throughout that next year, and we didn't run into trouble. But what it did is it scared the bejesus out of me, and I started thinking about we needed to get the healthcare fund reserve back up, but also this reserve is not cutting it. And so what you see in the green line is our targeted reserve secure funding level, the bottom chunk, I guess that's green, and that's what we keep in the healthcare fund. And we came up with the concept of the auxiliary fund to retain money above the green line up to the pink line or purple line in the general fund. And what happened is we increased funding to right the ship, and we had a number of really good years in the healthcare fund. And so the reserve went way up. And so rather than cut the funding to the healthcare fund, again, this is an area that has 5 to 7% inflation. So to go from short funding it to catching up could be a 10 or 15% swing. And so what we did is we established the auxiliary fund, and we kept a portion of those reserves in the healthcare fund, and it continued to go up. We have not had an increase in a number of years to the contributions to the healthcare fund because of this situation. What the auxiliary fund allows us to do is to hold money in reserve that we can move into the healthcare fund and get it back to secure funding. And it also can be used for other purposes. And what we've discussed as a board and as staff is that we could use some of those funds above the purple line, if you will, for if we have major refunds needed when the dark store theory appeals work their way out. Those could be substantial, and we have refined that number over the years. I think it's about, is it about 12 million? Where's Mark? 12? It's about 12 million right now in terms of what we would have to pay out if we had the worst case scenario, which is about a 40% reduction. And so, as those things work their way, we've kept that portion above the purple line, knowing that we could use that. The other thing is it's allowing us to keep funding steady and not be vulnerable to that situation I talked about before where things kind of go south and all of a sudden you've got to get through 18 months because you already set the next year's budget. So that's really the premise here. And what this really shows is right now we're in really good shape. We have plenty of money to have the full funding. And the full funding is 2 years of the healthcare fund having a drawdown. That would stabilize it. So the secure funding gets you most of the way. And then the full funding is 2 years of bad claims where you max out. And so that's what this is for. And as we find out how that goes with those large stores in the drugstores, it's basically your big boxes like your Walmarts and your Targets, Home Depot, et cetera, and then the CVS and the other one. And so that's really that dollar amount. We will know whether we need to keep that in. The other thing is this is in the general fund, and so the board could convert it to regular reserves at any time. So it's really, right now, it's a stabilization fund. It's a double backing for the healthcare fund that's so volatile, but it's keeping the dollars in the general fund so we have more flexibility. And then as we find out how that's going to play out with those large appeals, we'll know whether that some of this money will get spent for that. Now, that would need to come to the board because that's not formal, but that's just the general plan with this money.
Okay, so you're saying that actually our general fund reserves, this
Include the blue.
is reflected in it or is not?
The general fund dollars are the blue portion, and those are in there, and those are on Robin's charts where she pulls them out because it's on the auxiliary fund. So those are designated. The board has designated them. So the rating agencies know that we could use them, but it's not free and clear because the board's designated. There's a
Okay, so they're
potential use
actually
for it.
there, but they're not in the total of the reserves, unencumbered reserves.
Correct.
So I need to understand how many millions of dollars that we have in reserves that are designated to certain
Okay,
expenditures.
well, we could.
can get that.
Yeah, we could have
Okay.
a sit down on that one.
Okay, so this is,
There's a lot of pieces there, what you
Okay.
just asked for, actually.
thank you.
Almost halfway.
All right. So I kind of already talked about this, this slide, and I think I pretty much covered everything. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Robin for the next slide.
All right, I just want to walk through the request for additional resources before we head into CIP with Mark Dapp. For the 2023, we had $3.4 million in personnel requests and $6.4 million in non-personnel. This was for ongoing requests. The funded piece is about $8 million. However, I wanted to pull out some of that. Of the $8 million, $2.2 million includes fee revenue for mental health requests, and then $1.5 million is for wastewater expenditures. So that is what has been proposed, but again, that includes fee, grant, and tax support. So when you pull those two big pieces out, then you're really looking at around $4 million for that ongoing tax support. And then for one time, we have $9.5 million in non-personnel requested and $8.3 million. And again, if we pull out 2.2 million, the big pieces of that, just so you know, 2.2 million is for MEDAC vehicles and equipment. 1.5 million is for the airport, the New Century Parkway, and helping out with the revenue and expenditure relief. 1.7 million is public works overlays, and that's funded with CARS reserves. And then there's about 1.6 million for public works fleet capital that's funded with general fund reserves. And so, again, those main big pieces make up the majority of that total there. For personnel requests, the library had 3 FTE, 110,000. Looks a little low. Part of it's because those FTEs start later in 2023. I believe it's for Antioch. And then they'll come on full force in 2024. So that's when you'll see the full impact there. And then there's 1 FTE for Parks and Recreation at about 79,000. So then if you look at just an overall picture, public safety, we have about 1.3 million in personnel and 1.2 million in non-personnel, and then in some of the detail is there. Obviously, we get into more detail during the department presentations. Health and Human Services, we're at $500,000 for personnel and $300,000 for non-personnel. Support Services, $340,000 for personnel, $935,000 for non-personnel. And I would like to point out a lot of that is IT related, obviously with cybersecurity and other maintenance issues that we have. That's why you see that number a little bit larger than maybe past years. Infrastructure, zero as far as tax support. That's because that's wastewater pieces. And then Culture and Recreation, we do show zero. I had a conversation with Commissioner Ashcraft. It is confusing. When we show, and we need to probably find a better way to show this to explain it. When we show zero for Park and Recreation and Library, we're really looking at it that it's been funded within their existing mill levy. And so we're not increasing anything, but we should still probably show that because it is tax support. And so we will probably make that change going forward, but knowing that it's not a tax increase, it's just within that, or it's not a mill levy increase, it's within their existing mill levy.
And
Yes.
And your recommendation to increase the match from 3% to 4% on the retirement fund, I need to know how much that increases the budget.
It's about $1.5 million.
$1.5 million.
But to clarify, we're not increasing the mill levy for any of these.
No, none of this is increasing. This is within our existing mill, or our mill levy reduction. Yes, this would be the ongoing piece. And so overall, it's about 4.5 million, and then about 24 new FTE. So just as an overview, when you look at it by strategic program area. And then some additional requests for one-time funding. I'll let Scott kind of give a quick overview of these pieces.
So the first one says the small New Century building renovation. And I think we've talked about this recently in the SFMP. And that is the smaller building that's in the parking lot there of the New Century office building. We would be relocating Aging and Human Services, and that's a multi-service center that's currently rented. And then it would become a new place to provide services for mental health. So that would be services that currently folks in Gardner and Edgerton are driving all the way to Olathe for. And so we have that. And then the other stuff for Aging and Human Services, we should be moving them into our facility. They're in rental right now. That is not in the current CIP for 2023. Part of the thought process is quite frankly that we're still marketing that building. It's a tough market. That's a really big building. It's a really tough building to lease, but we have shown it to someone recently who was also interested in that building. So we're kind of keeping our options open, but that's what that one's for. Election office and parking improvement at $6.5 million. We've pretty much decided through the SFMP process that we're going to stay in that building. And so we've made market improvements to the parking before, but we haven't done all of them. And so there's additional there. Nursing center, $15 million is a number that we took our time until we were pretty comfortable with it. And that would be the dollars that would help Evergreen to establish a new building. And that does not include our annual contribution, which I think we have about 5 years left on that contract. So this is in addition, it's one time. Obviously, there's been a lot of talks about that. There's definitely a need that is coming up, and it's getting closer. But we didn't put it in this year's budget, but we do have a good number, so I appreciate that for Maury. The airport has asked for $2.5 million for 5 years. That's the cost of that building in terms of revenue lost and expense to keep the lights on and keep it maintained. We did put funding in for this year's budget, so that was the request. So we did partially fund it, so that was a weird one how to show it because I think we had $1.5 million in, but that was what the Airport Commission asked for. The presidential election, it's not time yet, but that's out there, so we're just kind of letting you know it's out there. We have three budgets for elections. We have off-year budgets, midterm, and presidential. And so the midterm and presidential bump up, we always just put in one time because we're usually in good shape on fund balance. So we show that is out there. And when we get there, the plan would be, unless we didn't have excess reserves, that we would use reserves for that. There's a number of options on home-delivered meals. There's a whole range, and so that's why it's a pretty broad number. A standalone, brand new would be the 17. Adapting something or buying something would be the 7. And again, that's pretty preliminary. We're still not decided on the path we're going to go yet. There's been a lot of discussion, and so that's why that is shown that way. The TBD on the new Crisis Intervention Center is, quite frankly, for a couple of reasons. One, we added the word partnership there. We think that this makes sense to look for partners if we go in this direction. We've certainly been hearing a lot about it. I did communicate with the Douglas County Administrator today, and she's going to get me numbers on what theirs is. Theirs is not open. The numbers that were quoted today, she did not think those were right, but she was going to verify, so we'll be able to talk about that next week. Don't have that information yet. What was in the SFMP was for a really large building where we did it from scratch. Joe Waters and I have discussed this. We think there's other ways to approach this and look at our capacity of our existing buildings, different ways. And again, there's the partnership piece and maybe a different path other than just a flat out build the whole thing from scratch. What? Yeah.
Well, I think the other thing to keep in mind, I appreciate the fact that, Douglas County is doing what they're doing, but our population is about 5 times larger, 4.5, 5 times larger than Douglas County. So a facility that might serve Douglas County would probably offer minimal opportunities in our county.
But my point was, I think maybe the number quoted today wasn't correct, so I want to at least let you know that. But again, like the chairman says, our numbers would be proportionally bigger. So, and Joe, did I miss anything on that? Okay.
Scott, so the $15 million would be a buyout on Evergreen, is that what you're saying?
It's not a buyout. The contractual obligation, I think, is about $5 million, $1 million a year for 5 more years. That's all we're obligated. Now, we have provided them with a facility, and they've been in a county building for as long as I can remember. That facility was built in the 90s. They were in the old county hospital, or the old and public health was over there and aging was over there, quite frankly. And that's getting back to the 90s. And I'm not even remember. I was in there for 2 months myself, and I'm having trouble remembering that. So that relationship goes back a long way. The nursing center when I came to the county was a county department. So we've been very joined at the hip with them. And I think the thought is that with that $15 million, that would put them in a place to become self-sufficient when the contract's over. So that's my understanding of what we're looking at, where the numbers are right now with what they would need basically to get into their own facility and not have to renew the contract at that point. So that's my understanding, which they'd be changing their model a little bit to where it'd be more sustainable. So, Maury, did I miss anything?
No, but I would add, to put a finer point on it, I don't think it's necessarily wrong to characterize it as a buyout in one sense, because, not to get into the details of conversations with them, but this would be in lieu of ongoing county
Correct.
support.
Right, yeah, so this is just incentivizing them to make a decision now instead of later.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that
Thank you.
I would say, Commissioner, is that they're looking at is this money would allow them to construct a facility with a different business model that could continue to serve the Medicaid beds, but also have some more profitable beds where they could function without support from the county. So,
And that's key to any future success.
yeah, so.
More expensive, so, that you can vote anywhere in the 2023 election. I mean, that's an off year, not as expensive, but I see during that presidential year, there could be added costs to vote anywhere. So we're going to have locations that are up and running for more than just one day. So, I think that number, I don't know, I think that number could be larger for the presidential election. And the home delivered meals, 7 to 17 million, it's quite a wide spread there.
Right, and that really represents if you quite frankly, bought land and built something from scratch that was freestanding versus buying something, or perhaps adding a kitchen to another building that we're building. So that's where the range comes from. And, the thing I'd add on the election center is, Fred's a little busy this year. It's his first year, and we haven't had a chance, but I do think that there's probably going to be operating costs as well when people can go to any site. And I think the model's going to have to change. We have a ton of small sites, and they can be small because the maximum number of people that can show up. When people can show up anywhere, you're not going to know where they're going to vote because they might vote close to where they live or where they work or halfway in between. And so we'll probably have fewer sites that are substantially bigger. So Commissioner Fast is right that that's going to completely change the model. And my guess is that the first year or two of that is going to be really tricky because you're just not going to know what behaviors are going to look like because we've never had that option. You have to, if you vote on election day, you have to vote by your house. So that'll be very different. Okay.
Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and go through just really tying some of the RERs that we have put into the budget with our board and community priorities, as Penny had discussed. And so first off, for public safety and criminal justice, with the sheriff, we have 7 new FTEs for security and safety. For the Department of Emergency Services, 2 FTE for 911 calls, just to help alleviate some of the pressures that are on those dispatchers. Also for emergency services, a new MEDEX station in Olathe for the increased call volume there, and then 1 new victim advocate for the district attorney. And then for health and human services, we have 1 housing coordinator to address the housing insecurity and affordability that has been discussed. Mental health has 3 new FTE within their department. Public health, they have a program manager for population health and health equity. And then in medical examiner's office, we have 1 new medical legal death investigator.
I have a question. I know that we have established this new housing coordinator, but I also know that in mental health that we have homeless caseworker outreach. So I need to understand, is this going to be a duplication of providing services? And so
I don't believe so, but next week, mental health will be here presenting, so that would be a great time to talk about that with them.
because we're this housing outreach, this is under planning. And the homeless caseworker outreach is under mental health. So I just want to make sure that we're not duplicating services, which will cause, more stress on our taxpayers.
Yeah, no, I believe they're different, and we'll make sure Tim's aware of that, and then he can address that during his presentation.
Okay, and then one other question. What was our level of staffing for Department of Health and Environment prior to the pandemic? And I know you won't have these.
Yeah.
This is just, these are for, give you time to get this information. What was our staffing prior to the pandemic? And how many staff positions were created to respond to the pandemic? And are we at the point that we could perhaps roll our staffing back towards pre-pandemic levels? So that's a...
Okay. Again, we can review that when we look at the Public Health Department.
Yes, we'll make them aware of the questions. Thank you. All right, so for parks and libraries, we did add 2 additional clerks to increase services for the library taxing district, and then also 1 new natural resources FTE for park and recreation. And then some other important services that we've addressed in this budget, we have election management system upgrades, and then also the ballot on-demand printers that we will be purchasing. Update to zoning regulations, and then also a project engineer at wastewater for all the new facilities that will be coming on.
Yes, I noticed that $500,000 for the planning department, and I was rather shocked about that.
I believe, and Scott can address that. So I think first they did their comprehensive plan, and so they have already completed that, and they've done that the last couple of years. We gave them some one-time funding for that. And so the next progression would be to go ahead and look at those zoning regulations. So it will be a multi-year project. The $500,000 is just one time, being a project account, and then they'll complete that over multiple years.
And we can go into detail when Jay's here, but I do think that, when they're doing large wholesale updates, that kind of goes beyond the staff's capacity. I mean, they'll be involved, but if you have any idea how busy planning is, that.
Oh, I know they're busy, and I know that this, the changing of the comprehensive plan that we've been going through, planning commission's been looking at for a year. I know that they're really swamped. And have we already talked about transportation? Did we already go over that?
Not,
Transit?
No, transit will have its own department budget time, and so you'll be able to ask questions. Part of the transit, they have the micro-transit program, and that's included in their RARs and CIPs.
The one thing that really jumped out at me was the Regional Fare Box Initiative, and it looks rather pricey. And so if you could have them look at that.
Yeah, infrastructure will be in a couple of weeks, and so when they come, then they'll be here for a department presentation to answer any questions you have.
You know, the process says there will be additional detailed discussions in regards to every agency.
Maybe you could
that's,
submit
you know,
all your
that's in our
questions,
budget,
Commissioner O'Hara, then they could come prepared.
So let's take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back to conclude. We're a little over halfway done, I think. Okay, we will reconvene from our break and continue.
All right. I'm going to give a quick update on performance measures, and then I will turn it over to Mark for CIP. We've continued to try to improve the performance measures process in the county and working with departments on that. So some highlights that we like to talk about: 100% participation in the new format this year from all departments. We're trying to link each measure to the BOCC strategic goal and priority. We have a future year estimate provided to give insight on the performance for the budget year being discussed. Then also what we've added on the individual performance charts is a small graph that shows a trend line for the 2019, 2020, and 2021, just for a visual within that dashboard. And then also we've highlighted new items on here on this chart so that you can see what we've done differently. Brian in our office, Brian Seidler, has done a great job. He's re-engineered all of the performance measures for the departments. So there you can see at the beginning, we have each measure related to the BOCC goal or priority. You can see the SG1, that's the strategic goal number 1. And then we've also added the 2023 estimate and then that trend line for the different measures within the department. So we're hoping to continue to improve. GFOA requirement is, one of them is to relate each measure back to the strategic goals and priorities of the board. And so we're working towards that. We know that the board will have future discussions on revising their goals and priorities as they move forward into the next year. And so we'll keep an eye on that and make sure that we're working with departments to match those up. So we just wanted to give you a quick update.
And before we go on, I want to take this time. We had 2 folks in our office that worked on this an awful lot. That's Leslie Friedel and Brian Seidler. And they also worked with Tanner Fortney and Chris Kelly from Mental Health. And they provided a ton of leadership. I will tell you that Penny exerted some leadership in the form of, you will do this. And we have made a push. And, you know, we had made pretty good progress last year. We weren't promising to be 100% done this year, but we got there. And so it wasn't just departments, it was agency and offices. And so everybody's participated. We had some folks that were completely swamped because of the pandemic and other things, and so those are the ones that, you know, have just gotten done recently. But I know we have a long way to go, but it was a big push to get done, and I want to thank those folks. I want to thank the folks out in the departments, offices, and agencies that participated. You know, the folks that report ultimately to Penny. You can direct them to do things. It's more of a partnership with the other folks, and so we're really grateful for that. We're extremely grateful that Tim DeWeese let Tanner and Chris work with us. They were invaluable, and like I said, Leslie and Brian have done a ton of work to get this done. The analysts have done a lot of work too, so I just want to recognize those folks because while we're not done, while we have a long ways to go, it is a milestone that I think, you know, needs to be recognized. Yes, sir.
Yes, Mr. Chair. If I could, maybe, Brian, before next week, I'd like to learn some more. If we could visit offline, I would appreciate that.
Good. All right. Thank you.
All right, now I'm going to turn it, oh, go ahead.
No.
I'm sure.
It's okay.
Question?
Mr. Chair, I just also want.
Is your mic on? Please, thank you.
Yes, it is now. I just also want to thank you too, because I know this was not an easy task to do this. I think all the departments need a round of applause for all the hard work that they've completed on this, because this is not easy.
Yeah, it was a big undertaking, and we got support from the board, and you know, we put a lot of effort into it. And like I said, there was just as many hours out in the departments and agencies and offices as there were with us. But those are the folks that led the charge. And like I said, we have a long way to go, but we wouldn't have got there without those folks. So it does feel good to be at this point, even though we have a ways to go.
All right, Mark Dapp, now we'll go through the CIP. Oh, sorry, you need that.
Good afternoon. So on April 21st of this year, we presented the 5-year CIP committee recommendation. This particular presentation will focus just on the budget year FY 2023. We'll look at the overall projects that are recommended, most importantly by a potentially funding source. So there are 5 distinct groups of funding the sources that make up the mechanisms for the CIP projects. In total, in FY 2023, there is $264.1 million of capital improvement projects that are recommended. Of that, 84%, or roughly $221 million, comes from dedicated funding sources. The rest of those projects are comprised of ad valorem or general tax revenue dollars. Trying to make the overall capital improvement project somewhat more digestible, we'll look at the projects with the dedicated funding sources. Most importantly is the wastewater projects, totaling roughly $131 million. This is roughly 50% of the entire capital improvement program for FY 2023. Of course, as we've reviewed in detail, those projects are funded by user fees. There are also $20 million worth of Parks and Rec capital improvement projects. This includes their capital replacement program, dredging of Heritage Lake, the park safety or park police safety plan, among others. There are also stormwater capital projects, roughly $23.4 million. You'll see that this number is significantly higher than what has been funded in previous years as a result of excess revenue collections that have occurred in FY 2021 and also projected in FY 2022. Those are funded from a dedicated sales and use tax of 0.1% that goes directly to stormwater capital projects. Another $5.5 million is requested for library projects. Similar to parks, this comes out of their dedicated mill levy in our projects that are requested that they have identified funding sources for. It does include roughly $1 million of reserves for the DeSoto, Spring Hill, and Edgerton renewal projects.
Yeah, I do have a comment on that $1 million. I talked to the folks, the past superintendent and the Chamber of Commerce on the facelift of their library, and they would really like to have that money. They didn't think that this was a good expenditure of resources because they really need a library down there, and that the school district had offered to use a dual purpose with the high school, and that they would really like the library to come back and see if there's any way that that plan could go forward. I don't know about DeSoto and Edgerton, but this $1 million isn't to expand anything, it's simply to renovate. And so perhaps the money could be better spent. I know in Spring Hill that they have a lot of questions on it.
As I recall, we've had discussions in past years with Spring Hill to a great extent about cooperating with the school district. And a public library in a school facility just does not work. We came to that conclusion because there are different materials in a public library that would not be appropriate for school. So appreciate the interest, but we've been there and it did not work. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also might mention that the library staff is in process right now of doing a study, taking public input. So there's been no definitive decision on what to do at this point. But the chairman's absolutely correct that that was considered, but because of various security reasons and other reasons, having the library within the high school was not going to be feasible.
Well, I question that if we have content in our libraries that's not appropriate for high schoolers, I have to wonder why it's in our libraries. But then the other point is that I know that the library seems very focused on spending $55 million for a new facility off of 151st and Antioch to replace that library. And that is just, that's a number that is just beyond belief. And I think that that really needs to be restudied. And so I don't know what the board has power over to as far as suggestions on that, but that's an extraordinary amount of money. And you know, that's a library that I go to, my children, my grandchildren, and I know that this is projected into the future, but that's just too much money.
Well, your expression of concern is not the first one that they've heard. from this dais. And so that will be considered by the library board. And when that recommendation, whatever that recommendation is, then the Board of County Commissioners will have an opportunity to speak to that.
Okay, thank you.
Just to finish, a couple of quick notes for the airport projects, it's roughly $24.1 million. That is split between $2.4 million, what you would consider traditional airport projects on the ground that are subject to FAA and KDOT match. The remaining $21 million is for Phase 2 of the New Century Commerce Center, which makes up the overwhelming majority of that requested amount. Finally, the Department of Emergency Services, $205,000 in what has become an ongoing annual renewal for the countywide radio system infrastructure project. There are 5 particular projects that have been identified as other funding sources. They don't necessarily fall into the clean dedicated funding source or general ad valorem. The first is the mental health TRP. This is an acronym for the recovery place. Building modifications that would allow for build out of the basement and create usable space for operations, just less than $1 million there. The new Human Services building, if you may remember, that was a recommendation for the new HSB building. The FY23 component of that is the study dollars only. This includes both design and operational studies centered around efficiencies to be gained, which would be funded from the public health fund balance to determine how we could best construct and use that new facility. Public Works, $2.4 million for their bridge, culvert, and roads program, which is somewhat of an ongoing project. It is unique in that it is split between $1.9 million of ad valorem and $500,000 of Public Works fund balance. And then a project that I believe the Commission is familiar with from last year, which is the Lackman 159th to 167th construction project. It is a $4.1 million project in total and is split in funding sources between the general fund and CARS reserves. Finally, the transit projects include all 4 of the different groupings of projects that they consider for their federal and local matches. This slide is a breakout of those projects that are funded simply with general fund balance or reserves. You'll notice that this amount is slightly higher than it has been in previous years, but that is somewhat offset by decreased debt service projects, just given the consideration of our current financial situation. All of these projects will be reviewed when the departments present their detailed budgets, so we can go into much greater detail at that time. But it includes a couple of projects for elections, a handful of projects for facilities, 3 projects for sheriffs, the previously mentioned project for planning, the zoning and subdivisions regulation, not what you would consider traditional capital improvement projects, but it is an expenditure of more than $100,000 is why it fits into this designation. And then finally, you'll see the general fund component of that previously mentioned Lackman 159th to 167th project. Finally, there are projects with ad valorem or debt funding. There is only one project that is earmarked to be debt funded with general fund providing the debt service dollars for those payments that was previously mentioned for the new Olathe facility for MedAct. That is a $9.8 million project. The debt service on that at 4% equals roughly $742,000 a year. So provide just kind of that budget stability and accounting for those in the out years. And then finally, you'll see that the DTI projects, facilities, and gyms are ongoing ad valorem dollars. They have been included in each of the prior year capital improvement programs to varying amounts, but it includes essentially what you would need for maintenance and operations of these 3 departments. This is a previously mentioned pie chart that shows just kind of that dedicated funding source. I think that the overwhelming takeaway from this project is just how large wastewater makes up a total of the $260 million capital improvement projects. You can see the number of funding sources that go into compiling the $261 million total, and of that general fund balance is roughly 6%.
And that's going to increase as we go forward as far as percentage?
Of the wastewater
Yes.
component, correct.
Okay, thank you.
These are projects that were, I believe, alluded to during the April 21st presentation that were included in the out years of the 5-year plan. They are not in, they were not requested for FY 2023, but they are kind of the known unknowns at this point, so that there is a need and a potential to identify funding for them, but we have not yet gotten to that stage of authorizing, recommending the project, or identifying funding. This is very similar to slide 28, but this is just the capital improvements component of kind of those known future needs, and it includes that data lab, New Century Data Lab renovation. It also has the mental health Shawnee campus, detention center improvements, adult residential campus projects, and then finally the crisis intervention center is something that we know will be a potential future need, but is not included in the FY23 budget. I will turn it over to Penny if there are no further questions.
Okay, we're ready for our last section. So wanted to highlight strategic priorities a bit more on just progress that we've made leading up to this budget and being further advanced in this 2023 proposed budget, and talk a little bit about upcoming challenges. So I highlighted what the priorities are for the board and what was outlined in the community survey. So what are some progress towards those? You can see under the major capital projects, although the courthouse opened in January of 21, now we're talking about the Johnson County Square and other things related to the courthouse. So parks and library projects continuing to be addressed multi-year in the strategic plans. You know, last week we celebrated the ribbon cutting of Tomahawk Wastewater Treatment Facility. Innovation area and collaborative culture, the first two we did talk about over the last few weeks as well, and that's wastewater saving $250 million in auxiliary treatment, and with the WIFIA funding or the loan, we were able to save substantial dollars, $80 million in that project by using that source. And then next week, New Century Commerce Center, we have the groundbreaking, so that's more progress there, and I know Mark mentioned it in his presentation as well. And then more generally, diversity and inclusion. And then on the next slide, serving our vulnerable populations. Although we don't have much of a added dollars in aging and human service area for the 23 budget, in the last two budgets, you may recall that we added $250,000 in 21, and then an additional $250,000 ongoing, for a total of $500,000 ongoing for aging services, and that carries through in this budget. So it's being implemented as we speak. And then 30 new mental health FTEs. This was added, says 30. So some of those were done outside the budget process, and Scott talked about that earlier with the grants that we received since the last budget, and a few of them in the budget process last year. So those are updates. And then in the transit area, you know that we brought an item forward recently to change the day-to-day management. We've talked about microtransit, so that's further in this budget proposal and CIP. And then upcoming challenges. So we did talk a little bit about housing insecure and homeless, and we also mentioned that it will require partners. It's not solely the county's responsibility, but the community has identified, and many of you have identified, that that's an ongoing strategies that we need to continue to work on with partners. How to best utilize county buildings with our strategic facilities master plan that we've discussed over the last several months, I guess maybe year plus, internally as well. How do we continue to advance that plan and find opportunities as we move forward and work in the coming budgets? And then continuing to address the workforce market pressures and staying aware of what the latest is there, which I mentioned earlier might be a multi-year plan. And Scott mentioned potential recession, so just being ready with our 5-year forecast, 5-year planning, being able to be ready and adapt when necessary. Construction inflation was mentioned earlier, but again, it's worth noting because of the inflation is much higher than it has been in previous years. Continued pressure on the mill levy and how we balance that with having adequate reserves in the coming budgets. And then just to summarize, really everything that we've talked about today is this budget considered the needs for the community and organization to being able to provide quality service. Reflects a plan to serve our residents, be good stewards, and position our organization for the future. Includes mill levy reduction, which is achievable in the same year that we're also addressing compensation and our service delivery needs. And so with that, I'll turn it to Robin for an upcoming budget process reminder on the calendar and the upcoming schedule.
I would like to know if the staff would do the percentages of the rollback. What percentage is that rollback? The 0.8 on the general fund, and then the percentages on the Parks and Rec and library.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, the 0.8 is probably about roughly 5%, but we'll get the exact math.
Right, so then that's an increase of approximately 4.7%.
It's 4.85. If a constant mill levy would have been 9.7, and this is 50/50, so it's 4.85% increase.
I just want to note that in 2021, our taxes, which is was 425 million, and this year it's 485, somewhere in there. I don't have that number right. Oops, I do too. 484. And so from the 2 years, that's 16.6% increase, and I just want.
Some of that's one time.
That would be all, are you talking about all taxes?
That is the
That's
county
sales.
taxing district.
Right,
That's it.
Sales taxes as well as
Yeah, that's
property
all
tax.
tax.
yeah.
And it's got
But
one, it's
taking
got
out of
one
the-
time, it's got
right.
one time in there as well.
Yeah.
Correct, but taking money out of our economy is 16.6% more. It's just a number.
Well,
Yeah, some of
some
that's
of
one
those sales taxes are dedicated for public safety, and there are debt obligations that were created as a result of those sales tax elections, so need to keep that in mind.
Thank you.
Okay, to wrap up here for the 2023 budget calendar, obviously we finished today with the proposed overview. We'll start our budget presentations next week. Within all of your books, you should have the material for Health and Human Services and Culture and Recreation. I snuck into your offices and put them in while you're all out here today, so you should all have them. If something happens and I mixed them up, please let me know.
And if anything's missing from your office.
Yeah, I promise, I didn't touch anything. So we'll have 4 sessions with department budget presentations. Each week, we'll give you information for the next week and hopefully even more in advance as we finish that. The June 16th and June 17th date, that's when we'll actually have the board's budget deliberations where we'll talk through any revisit items or anything you want to discuss to finalize that maximum expenditure amount. And that's what we'll discuss on June 23rd. So we'll set the maximum expenditure amount. It's not the final. It's just we cannot increase it at that point. We can only lower that expenditure. Our public hearing, revenue neutral rate hearing will be August 22nd. And then our BOCC budget adoption will be September 1st. And then the following slides, you can see what's coming up. Health and Human Services, Culture and Recreation will be next week. Then we'll follow up with Records and Taxation and Support Services. Public Safety and then outside agencies will be on June 2nd. And then we'll finish up with Infrastructure on June 9th. And at that point, are there any final
Let me
questions?
ask this question. I think I would encourage commissioners to review the budget documents that would presented on a weekly basis as departments come before us, so we don't go into those meetings completely cold, and that we have the recommendations in regards to each department. So I think that will be helpful because there will be a lot of information that we'll need to review. So please keep your budget book handy and coordinate with the weekly departments that we'll be reviewing. There was another question.
You gave a lot of dates, like August. Can you have staff put that on our calendar? Like you mentioned August, you mentioned a September.
Oh, yes, we'll make sure that all of those are on your
No,
calendar.
they're not now.
Okay, we'll make sure that they are.
Okay.
Okay.
Chairman,
Yes.
Ed this morning here, if I could, I've got one answer to a question that arose today regarding the use of ARPA funds to pay off the public safety sales tax early. That is not, as I suspected, an allowable use. Debt service is specifically called out as not allowable.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay. Other questions, comments? Ms. Hansley?
Yes, I just a quick question for Mr. Neufeld. At the beginning of the presentation, you'd mentioned that with this proposed 1 mill levy reduction, this would be, when was the last time the mill levy was this low? You said it was the lowest in X number of years?
I believe since 2014.
2014.
Oh, good. Penny's got the information.
However,
From Gerald's
it,
press release.
however, it's not the mill levy, it's how much the taxes are increasing because of the increased in valuation.
Well, it's a combination of both. It's not one. If the mill levy was not reduced, then the sales, or the property tax revenue would be much higher, so it's really a combination.
Yeah, in
Mr. Chair, if I could follow up on that.
Yes, please.
I mean, something that I have found myself explaining to people a lot recently is that, and we all know this here, but that the county portion of their property tax bill is only about 15 or 16%. That the majority, about 56%, is their school taxes. And as I always tell them, I have no authority over the school mill levy. And so I think people need to realize that, because sometimes they see the bottom line on their property tax bill and they assume that that is all going to the county. And I think we need to continue to educate the public about that there's city, there's all kinds of other taxing jurisdictions in there, and that we're just one small piece of that.
I think that when you add in the Parks and Rec, and if you're in Overland Park and you're in the Shawnee Mission School District, it's approximately 24.6% of the total. Their total mill levy is about 101 mills, and with the county and the parks and library, it comes up to approximately 24.6%.
All you have to do is look carefully at your tax bill,
Yeah,
and
and so
that
it's
is all explained. And so that's, it's all there.
Yeah, and, you know, the thing I would remind the commission of is, you know, there's the tax bill, we send out the entire tax bill and we collect the entire tax bill. So, you know, I think sometimes we get credit as if we levied all of that, which of course we haven't. We're facing very serious inflation and very serious employee pressures. And, you know, Maury and I have a meeting coming up with the sheriff to talk about his 40-some deputy vacancies. There are departments that report to Maury that are struggling to keep their doors open. And we haven't had inflation like this, and we haven't had, and so we try to take a balanced approach. You know, the rolling back a mill is not insignificant. You know, Penny proposed a decrease in all 3 taxing districts. We've not done that before. And so, you know, we're trying to have a balanced approach, and we're trying to pay attention to not just the taxpayers, but the services that we provide to the taxpayers. And so that's a very important part. And, you know, we really collaborated with the organization to get to this point, but I think the pressure on taxpayers is there, but the pressure on us is there as well. And so we're trying to acknowledge both of those and be realistic about both of those in this proposal.
Well, I think it's worth noting that a 1 mill levy reduction would offset the mill levy increase that we had to use in 2016, I believe it was, when the state legislature reduced
Right.
the mortgage registration fees. So, you know, maybe perhaps one of these days they'll understand that if you remove revenue from local government, it does have an impact elsewhere. But we will be in the position of having offset that mill levy increase. Okay. Other questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you very much, and we've got busy weeks ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.